Hello, we're going to be in Joshua chapter 1 today. I hope you'll get your Bibles. This chapter is kind of the introduction for the book of Joshua. The book of Joshua breaks pretty normally into two halves. Chapters 1 through 12 deal with the conquest, and 13 through 24 deal with the allocation among the tribes. Let's look then at chapter 1 if we could. Now, my New American Standard starts out, "Now it came about." But a little more literal of the Masoretic Hebrew text would be, "and it came to pass." Notice the "and" there, the conjunction. We're continuing the same story that was stopped in Deuteronomy. As you know, the historical setting is that we get to the plains of Moab in the book of Numbers, and then Deuteronomy is really Moses re-preaching through the law to adapt it from a nomadic situation to a settled situation that the people of Israel will confront in the Promised Land. After the death of Moses, now it's very important we realize that Moses is dead, and the reason he's dead is because he disobeyed God. We see that in several places. Numbers 20, verse 12, Numbers 27:14, Deuteronomy 3:26 is because he struck the rock instead of speaking to the rock. Moses brought that up again and again, and finally God said, "I'm tired of listening to that. You can't go in personally. You can go up on Mount Nebo and see it, but you can't go in." Now that's very important. Moses dead and Joshua's taking over. The key to Joshua is not man and his power and trust and ability, but God and the fulfillment of his promise. This is going to be what God had promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The thrust of this is the sovereignty of God over history, the provisions of God to meet his promises. Now he chooses men who are faithful. Yeah, like all of us. Mixture of doubt and faith. Joshua is one of the stronger leaders, but he still is a human leader, and the key is the power of God. Now it says Moses, the servant of the Lord. This is an honorific title. It was used of Abraham in Genesis 26:24. It's used of David in 1 Kings 8:66. I believe it's even one time used of Nebuchadnezzar, who of course is not a believer, but is an instrument in the hand of God. Now it will be used of Joshua, but only after his death in Joshua 24:29. I think it may be the source of Paul's favorite phrase, the slave of Christ, the servant of the Lord. It may go back to this honorific title here in the Old Testament. Notice then it said that the Lord spoke, and of course this is the covenant name for God. Notice it's in all caps. It comes from Exodus 3:14, where God reveals his name to Moses and explains it. It's basically the Hebrew verb to be, I am, and it's in all caps in our English Old Testament. Notice if you would, it said to Joshua. Now the word Joshua, originally his name was Hoshea, son of Nun. We see that in Numbers 13:16. But when the name Hoshea means salvation, but when you add the covenant name for God, Yahweh, you get Hoshea, Yeshua, which is exactly the name for Jesus. It means salvation is of Yahweh, Yahweh is salvation, something like that. So Joshua and Jesus are exactly the same Hebrew name. Now many folks have tried to make Joshua a type of Christ. I get somewhat nervous about typology unless it's specifically identified in the New Testament, because there's no bounds on the creativity of even of godly men. So I personally prefer typology based only on the New Testament, because I am a historical grammatical interpreter and I want to base it from the text, not from my imagination. Notice he's called the servant of Moses. Now this is a title that means a voluntary aid, and so he's called that throughout the book, except the end after he dies. Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise, cross this Jordan. Now, folks, that wasn't no easy task. This apparently was the time of the year when the Jordan was flooding. The word Jordan means the descender, and it dropped several thousand feet in just a few, I believe something like 80 miles, maybe 75 miles. So it was a rapidly rushing, had cut a deep gorge. And not only that, but it was deep. And we learned from chapter 3, verse 15, that this was the time of the year it was flooding. So to say to the people, let's cross the Jordan, be like me and you saying, let's cross the Mississippi at flood tide. Going to take some faith here, like it took the Hebrew children about into the Promised Land. Their faith wasn't strong. God's testing these to say, will you trust me? Will you follow me? Will you walk through this swollen river with me? And they're going to say, yes. Yes, we will. You and all this people to the land which I am giving them. Now here's the emphasis back to God is giving the land. We see the same thing down in verse 6 where he says, the land which I swore to your fathers. This is exactly what he promised. In Genesis chapter 7, where he promised it to Isaac. Genesis 26:3, Abraham 12:7, where he promised to Abraham. Genesis 26:3, where he promised it to Isaac. Genesis 28:13, where he promised it to Jacob. And Exodus 6:8, where he promised it to all of Israel. And it's the land that he promised. Now, in the Abrahamic covenant, that's basically Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, there's an emphasis on the land that I'm going to give you and the seed I'm going to give you. The Old Testament emphasizes the land, while the New Testament emphasizes the seed. And I think when you see that, you see how these testaments are linked together with two different emphases, but going back to the Abrahamic covenant. Now, notice what it says. Now therefore arise, cross the Jordan, I'll give this land to you. Verse 3, every place which the sole of your feet treads, I have given it to you, just as I spoke to Moses. Now to me there's a wonderful combination here. The sovereignty of God says, I am going to give it to you. I am in control of history. It is mine. I will do it for you. I am God. But the other side of the coin is, which is true in every relationship between God and man, he says, but you're going to have to walk that way. You're going to have to put on your battle gear. You're going to have to conquer the land, but I'm going to give it to you. Now, the strange dichotomy between the sovereignty of God and man's free will is seen even here as it is throughout the Scriptures. Now, it continues then when it says, from the wilderness, and this is the Negev, it's that southern desert. Exactly where that border is, we're not sure, but it's somewhere maybe just down south below the Dead Sea, from the Negev, the wilderness, to this Lebanon. Now, Lebanon is a word that means white, and many of us believe it refers to the peak of Mount Hermon, and so somewhere close to modern Lebanon, even as far as the great river Euphrates. Now, of course, if you look at a map, the Euphrates is way over in the Fertile Crescent. But if you follow the Euphrates from Ur of the Chaldees, it makes its way around the Fertile Crescent, or the land of Mesopotamia, you'll see the headwaters of the Euphrates are north of Israel. And that seems to be this idealistic boundary. All the land of the Hittites. Now, what about this Hittite? Well, if we compare this with Deuteronomy chapter 11, verse 24, that's not where it is. Let's see if I can find where that is. Let's see. Lost it in my notes. There are some other places where the same boundary line is given. The Hittites now are a group of people we have found in the Suzerain Treaty documents. Their major kingdom, as we know, was in modern Turkey. Central Turkey is where we found it. But we know in time that they controlled northern Syria, and that seems again to fall in line with the headwaters of the Euphrates. Notice it says, as far as the Great Sea, now that's got to be the Mediterranean Sea, toward the setting of the sun will be your territory. There's only a few times in Israel's history when they controlled this area, and that was during the reigns of David and Solomon. And that was the only time that these ideal boundaries were ever fully settled. No man will be able to stand before you. Now, this is something he repeated to Moses. It kind of has military overtones. Matter of fact, much of this through here seems to be very close back to Deuteronomy chapter 3. It's where much of this seems to be repeated. But no one will be able to stand before you. You might want to see Deuteronomy 7:24 and Deuteronomy 11:25, where the same thing is mentioned to Moses. Much that God said to Moses, God will now say to Joshua in the very same way, which shows that God's going to be with him as he was with Moses. Now, notice it says, I will be with you, I will not fail you or forsake you. Oh my, isn't that wonderful? It is very important to me to realize this very same promise then in verse 9 is repeated. It's the promise of the presence. I guess the greatest thing God can give is to say, no matter what happens, friend, I'm going to be with you. Wherever you walk, I'm going to walk with you. Trust me. Now, this word for do not fail means he is not weak. And the word for do not forsake me means he will never relax. Do you catch what he's saying? Now, this be strong and courageous, that's going to be repeated in verse 6, and it said over and over and over again, I will be with you. I will not fail you nor forsake you. Therefore it says, be strong and courageous. We find this very same thing in verses 6, 7, 9, and 18. Now, it's been the same encouragement for Israel quite often. Don't be afraid. I'm going to be with you. Hang in there. God will accomplish it, is the thing. Just trust me and walk with me. And I shall give this people possession, the land which I swore to their fathers to give them. It's that consummation of the old covenant. This very same promise seems to be given to Joshua in Deuteronomy 31, verses 7 and 8. And really, to all Israel, in that same context, he promises Israel he'll do that very same thing. Notice verse 7. Only be strong and very courageous, and be careful to do according to the law of Moses, my servant, commanded you. Now remember that there is a condition here of God walking with them, and that condition is based on their obedience. We see that it's very clear here. Verse 8 is going to have three characteristics of their obedience, and I think we need to realize that obedience is part of the covenant. Jesus said it so well when he said, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not the things I tell you to do?" That's Luke 6:46. God's saying, I've told you what to do. I've given you a clear pattern to follow. Now walk in it. Be careful to walk in it. And that's what he's saying here. We have this same kind of emphasis about being careful to do all the law. You might want to see Deuteronomy 5:32 and 33. You might want to see Deuteronomy 6:1 through 4, mentioned several times. Deuteronomy 17 and Deuteronomy 6:1 through 4, Deuteronomy 6 verse 17, and Deuteronomy 6 verse 24 and 25 for this emphasis on obeying the law, performing it. Now, do not turn from the right or the left. Now remember, this idea of deviation from a path is the root of the Hebrew words for sin. So what it's saying is, keep straight, keep in the path that I have shown you, and don't deviate one way or the other. That's very important. Now verse 8. There are three aspects of this book that I think are extremely important about how they are to treat the law. And all three are here in verse 8. You might want to mark them in your Bibles. And this book of the law, first I want to say is, it's obvious that Joshua had something of the law of Moses written down. There are many people to say no, that the law was written much later, and of course the JEDP theory of source criticism for the Pentateuch divides the law up into different periods and different groups, with Deuteronomy being written in 621 under the kingdom of Josiah. I have real problems with that. It's obvious that Joshua had something of the law of Moses written down. You might want to see Deuteronomy 17, 18, and 19, Deuteronomy 31, 24 through 26, and Deuteronomy 31, 11, where it talks about it being written. Part of the law was written, and I think we need to see that. Now here are the three aspects that I think are so crucial as we look at verse 8 about how we are to treat the Word of God. And here it refers to the Torah, the first division of the Hebrew canon. Number one, the law shall not depart from your mouth, which means you ought to keep talking about it. Back in Deuteronomy 6 that I just gave you a minute ago, it talks about teaching our children the things of God, reminding them whenever we get up or sit down, write it on our doorpost, put it on our forehead to remind us, put it on our left arm so when we see it we'll do it. And then number B, but you shall meditate on it day and night. We're not only to talk about it all the time, we're to think about it. Think about how it applies to our life, what its meaning is, how it relates to our culture. And for that, you might want to compare Deuteronomy 6, verses 6 through 9, and Psalms 1, verse 2, and the beautiful Psalm 119, verse 97. Meditate day and night. And here's verse C. So that you may be careful to do according to all that is written in it. Wow, there's the third aspect. We're to talk about it, we're to think about it, and we're to act on it. I think that's so important. So you make your way prosperous, and then you will have success. Notice the condition, if then. Now, it is true in the Old Testament that God's sign of blessing His people was, if they keep His law, He will physically prosper them. I think that's very true, although I think from the New Testament, we've got to be careful we don't push that as the only truth. For the New Testament seems to modify that some in the sense that there's going to be persecution for Christians. You might want to see 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 12 through 16. It would be unfortunate to proof text the Old Testament as the standard for Christians, because the basis of the Old Testament is performance, and the performance issued in success. But the problem is nobody could ever do that, not the Old Testament people or the New Testament people of God. And so the New Covenant is based not on our performing the Old Testament law, but the law being within our heart, a changed heart based on the grace of God and our personally receiving the finished work of Jesus Christ. So we got to be careful we don't mix these covenants up, because they really are on a different basis. One seems to be focused into obedience and faith, and the other one seems to be focused in on faith that issues in obedience. And I think that's a key. Now, notice if you would, verse 9 continues, have I not commanded you, be strong and courageous? There's the positive stuff. Stand up, Joshua. And everybody's going to say that to him. Verse 18, even the tribes on the eastern bank, Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, be strong, Joshua. Does this imply that Joshua is necessarily a weak man? We sometimes get on Timothy in the New Testament's case because Paul continues to encourage him not to be afraid. Well, I don't think Joshua is a timid man. He's been a warrior all his life. He's been in battle after battle. They're just saying, be like Moses, be bold, stand in there, hang in there. And then here's the negative aspect. Do not tremble or be dismayed. One's positive, one's negative. For the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. What a tremendous promise. The presence of God is with us, which I think is the greatest promise that there is. Now, verse 10. Then Joshua commanded the officers of the people, saying, now the officers of the people seem to be not a military commander, but more like an official, a scribe, a administrative leader. We see that mentioned in Numbers 11:16. They are helpers of the tribal elders, and it probably is that same group. Stands for foremen or administrators, that kind of thing. The officers of the people. They're the ones that are going to pass through and disseminate this information. Pass through the midst of the camp and command the people, saying, prepare provisions. Now it literally means meat. They're to go ahead and prepare some food. Get ready to travel is what they're saying. For within 3 days you're going to cross the Jordan. Now this 3 days is used several times in the Bible, which seems to be not so literal as kind of it's usually associated with some cultic rituals of purification. They were to probably abstain from sex. They were probably to wash their clothes, wash their body. It took several days to get the camp ready, to get some food prepared, to do these ritual cleanliness procedures, and that's what this seems to imply. We're going to cross Jordan to go in and possess the land which the Lord your God is giving you to possess it. Look at verse 12. And the Reubenites and the Gadites and the half-tribe of Manasseh, Joshua said. Now this is why I think that Joshua is linked historically with Deuteronomy. If you remember the book of Deuteronomy, or excuse me, the Pentateuch, in Numbers 32, 1 and following, we have the account of where Moses gives this land on the eastern side of the Jordan to these 3 tribes. They asked for it. It was pasture land. It's famous pasture land. And they had a lot of flocks, and they wanted this. And Moses said, okay, I'll give this to you, and your families can stay here and possess these villages of the people that we've destroyed. Og, king of Bashan, those kings. But your men must go before the other tribes in battle array first, because you can't rest till all of the nation of Israel rest. So these 3 tribes, now Joshua's going right back over that and reminding them of the deal they made. Yes, you're going to stay here, but you must go first into battle. That's the way the deal was. Remember the word which Moses, the servant of the Lord, commands you, saying, the Lord your God gives you rest and will give you this land. Now this same thrust about rest is found in Deuteronomy 3:18 through 20, and you might want to see that as well as this Numbers 32. I want to mention here that the word rest has several meanings in the Bible. I guess the most beautiful passage on the rest, the 3 different kinds of rest, is found in the ending of Hebrews chapter 3 and the beginning of Hebrews chapter 4. It's used first to describe the Sabbath rest of God at creation. Then it's used to provide the promised land rest of the tribes finally inheriting the promised land. And third, it's used of heaven. And if we don't see in context which it's referring to, we're going to really badly misinterpret not only the Old Testament, but this particular part of Hebrews. Your wives, your little ones, your cattle shall remain in the land which Moses gave to you beyond the Jordan, but you shall cross before your brothers. Look at your translation. Now my New American Standard has in battle array. Now this seems to imply, in my translation, they're to wear their armor. But the Arabic root from this word seems to mean a group of 5. And it was used for the 5 different parts of an invading army. Let's think for a minute. There was the avant-garde, or the point people, which would be Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh. There was the main body of troops. There were the 2 flanks, the left side protector and the right side protector, and there was the rear guard. It seems to be this marching order that's referred to by this word battle array. If you remember the marching order for the tabernacle in the wilderness, how the tribes were camped around it, it's this very same military order, which tells us what? First of all, that they got this from the Egyptians. It's one of the reasons we think that Numbers is so historical, because this is the marching order of the marching array of the Egyptian army. It was the same thing used all through the wilderness as they carried the tabernacle around, and this very same battle array is going to be used as they enter the promised land. Until the Lord your God gives your brothers rest, as he gave you, and they possess the land which the Lord your God is giving them. Now, there's been much discussion about this, the book of Joshua. Is it actually history or is it theology? And the reason I guess there's been so much problem is that Numbers chapter 1 seems to imply that they won the promised land only in little bitty isolated skirmishes. But the book of Joshua 1 through 11 seems to imply that they just went in and totally destroyed the Canaanites. I think what we have here is a combination of those two to really somehow tell us what really happened. For it seems that Joshua is going to break the back of the main Canaanite or Amorite armies. He's going to take over these big cities. He's going to destroy the major opposition. But I think we even see hints in the book of Joshua that each tribe must aggressively, militarily possess its own tribal allocation. And there's a lot of mopping up work to do. And the truth is, many of the tribes did not fully possess their land. And there were Canaanite pockets throughout the land of Israel for years and years and years, which really caused them the misery. And I think we're going to see that through here. Then you shall return to your own land and possess that which Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you beyond the Jordan toward the sunrise. The reason that's so significant, the rest of the tribes are going to have to wait on their tribal allocation until we get to Joshua 13 through really 22. But Moses already made a deal with these tribes, and their allotment is not by lot as the other ones were, but are already set. And Moses promised, and it was the word of the Lord when Moses spoke. And they answered Joshua, saying, all that you have commanded us we will do, and wherever you send us we will go. Boy, it sounds real important. Of course, it sounds like we're going to obey you like we obeyed Moses. But the truth is, if you read the book of Numbers, boy, you hope they do a better job than their parents did to Moses. And just as we obeyed Moses in all things, so we'll obey you. Only may the Lord your God be with you as he was with Moses. Now here's the continuity. They are using titles and phrases and descriptions for Joshua that they used for Moses. The power is from God. There is a transition of authority, but really there's the same sovereign God over it all. These tribes are affirming that. Okay? Anyone who rebels against your command and does not obey your words and all that you command him shall be put to death. Only be strong and courageous. And here again we have the emphasis on that you are the leader. We will obey you. You are the instrument of God. Now again, the nation of Israel is not a democracy, nor is it a dictatorship. It's basically a theocracy. God was in control, but he chose, in this case, Moses and Aaron first, and here Joshua and Eleazar chose them to speak for him and stand for him. But the truth is, God was in control. And we call this a theocracy. And that's the way Israel was meant to be governed. But we see the problem was this in the book of Judges, and we see early in the book of 1 Samuel that they asked for a king like the surrounding nations. Now the problem wasn't they asked for a king, but that they wanted a king like the surrounding nations. They were rejecting God's control of their country and wanted just a oriental potentate. And boy, that caused them the miseries. Well, this is the beginning chapters of Joshua. I want to go back a minute and maybe pick up on a few things about Joshua in this introductory tape on chapter 1. I want you to know that Joshua is named Moses' successor quite early in this book, in the Pentateuch. If you go back, he first appears as the official successor of Moses in Numbers 27, 15 through 23. It's also mentioned in Deuteronomy 3, 21 and 22, and Deuteronomy 31, 1 through 8. And those passages are very similar to the account that we have. God's going to tell them what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. And so it'd be very good to go back and read Numbers 21 and 27, which tell about, 27 and 32, which tells about the background to the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh. And then Deuteronomy 3 and Deuteronomy 31 almost have the same account of what's going to happen once they enter the promised land. And I think you ought to see that. Again, I want to mention to you that it's going to be a real act of faith in crossing the Jordan, and God's going to tell them to do it, God's going to promise to do it, but they have to implement it. This chapter is a great, I think, theological piece on the sovereignty and initiating activity of God, but his desire that his people trust him and follow in his footsteps. There's a conditional element that man must choose to participate. And it's always a little beyond man's reach. You know, how do you get across this roaring river? Well, God promised to do it. Well, let's get our feet wet, and when we get our feet wet, then God does it. Now, it's not God helps those who helps themselves. That's not at all what this is saying. But it is saying that God has chosen that his people must respond to him in faith. Both in their hearts and in their actions. And that's going to show this. The other thing I think is important as we begin this book is to realize that though there is some typology here, we must be very careful about locking it down too hard. Because when we do, we can almost prove anything. And this is a radical difference, this covenant, between the new one. To go back through here and do a character study on Joshua and just to use these stories to make some little moral truth or use him as a type of the Christian life, in my opinion, is as an allegory and spiritualizing and not proper hermeneutical technique. Because this is not a little character story about a person. It's about the sovereignty of God in the nation of Israel. And we make it little character studies or little moral stories, we destroy that historical context. And the other is, if we make Joshua a type and Moses a type and the Jordan River a type and the Promised Land a type, and then we really are, I think there's a possibility there are types here. But for me, it's safer just to mention those that are mentioned in the New Testament. Well, I've really enjoyed being with you, and we'll see you again, same time, same place, next week. God bless you.